17%. That is the rate of serious congenital disorders found in children born to male liquidators between 1987 and 1992, according to a Ukrainian health ministry study that was classified until 2006. The expected rate in the general population is approximately 3%. The study tracked 14,000 children across Ukraine and Belarus, comparing them to control groups whose fathers had no radiation exposure. The findings were consistent across multiple health indicators: elevated thyroid disease, immune system disorders, chromosomal abnormalities, and cancers appearing in adolescents at rates 5 times higher than baseline. The Soviet position, maintained for decades, was that radiation could not cause heritable genetic damage in humans. The data from Liquidators' children suggested the Soviet position was wrong. Or so the terrified families, local dissidents, and a traumatized public were led to believe. The narrative surrounding the children of Chernobyl's liquidators represents one of the most profound intersections of historical tragedy, advanced genomic science, and human psychology in modern history. It is a story where what people felt in their bones clashed violently with what the world's premier geneticists would eventually measure in pristine laboratories. To understand how an entire generation became trapped in a self-fulfilling prophecy of ill health, you have to go back to the beginning.
It is April 26, 1986. You are standing in the shadow of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, then a republic of the Soviet Union. The catastrophic explosion of Reactor Number 4 has just released unprecedented quantities of radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. This event, driven by a flawed RBMK reactor design and exacerbated by a severe lack of safety culture rooted in Cold War isolation, necessitates an immediate and massive human intervention. There is no time for sophisticated robotics. The containment relies on flesh and blood. In the immediate aftermath, the focus is purely on survival and containment. Ivan, a firefighter deployed within an hour of the explosion, witnesses the sheer horror of the acute disaster response. He and his men stand amidst the burning debris. At first, they joke about the radiation. It is invisible, it is odorless. But then the grim reality sets in. Ivan watches a comrade begin bleeding from the nose and mouth. The man's body turns black as he succumbs to acute radiation syndrome. Within mere weeks, 28 individuals die this agonizing way.
High above the exposed core, Ukrainian photographer Igor Kostin flies in a helicopter just hours after the explosion. The intense, invisible, ionizing radiation ruins every frame of his film except for one. That surviving image is grainy and filled with static, a visual representation of deadly energy destroying the film itself, capturing the macro horror of the burning reactor. In the days, months, and years that follow, the Soviet government mobilizes an estimated 600,000 military and civilian personnel. They are miners, soldiers, firefighters, and engineers. They are forever memorialized as liquidators, operating in highly contaminated environments to prevent secondary explosions that could have rendered vast swaths of the European continent uninhabitable. Approximately 240,000 of these liquidators receive the highest radiation doses while conducting major mitigation activities directly within the 30-kilometer exclusion zone during the crucial years of 1986 and 1987.
The cleanup effort reaches its zenith between 1986 and 1989. Liquidators are deployed to strip radioactive topsoil, decontaminate infrastructure, and construct the initial concrete and steel sarcophagus over the ruined reactor core. Igor, a liquidator conscripted to strip the earth, recounts rolling up the contaminated topsoil like a carpet and dumping it into unlined open pits. During this era, information regarding the true danger of the environment is heavily suppressed by Soviet authorities. The initial scope of the explosion is hidden from the public, breeding a deeply ingrained cynicism toward state-sponsored truth. But the true terror begins when the surviving liquidators return home. They are hailed as the ultimate saviors of the European continent, yet they return to their communities with a terrifying new burden.
Liquidators are officially instructed by authorities not to have children for 5 years following their service. This official, chilling directive plants the earliest seeds of transgenerational anxiety. Men return to their wives and girlfriends burdened with the belief that their bodies are fundamentally, permanently tainted. For those who defy this order or who have already conceived, their pregnancies are shrouded in a paralyzing dread. Consider the story of an unnamed son of a liquidator, conceived shortly after his father's significant exposure. His mother is persistently and aggressively pressured by medical professionals to abort him. Doctors warn her that the child might be an abomination or a deformed mutant. The psychological violence inflicted on these mothers is a largely untold tragedy. They endure 9 months of pregnancy utterly convinced by their own doctors that they are carrying radiation-poisoned anomalies. The shadow of the Chernobyl mutant becomes a powerful cultural trope, heavily stigmatizing the descendants of the cleanup workers. A central, haunting question takes root. Did paternal or maternal exposure to severe ionizing radiation result in mutated DNA being passed to offspring conceived after the disaster? For decades, the lived experiences of the liquidators' families, plagued by profound fears of severe birth defects, inherited cancers, and mysterious ailments, clash dramatically with mainstream epidemiological data. The foundation for a massive, generational psychological trauma is laid. But what was actually happening inside their selves? It is 1991. You are walking the gray, brutalist streets of Kiev. The Soviet Union is collapsing, but the radioactive dust of 1986 has already settled deep into the soil and deeper into the minds of the citizens. The men who saved Europe are now returning to their families, but they are not returning whole. They carry a heavy, invisible burden. Hundreds of thousands of previously healthy men are becoming chronically ill, disabled, or dying prematurely. They suffer from severe cardiovascular disease, leukemia, crippling depression, and alcoholism. The fathers are rotting away from the inside, and their children are watching them deteriorate. This is the fertile ground where the seed of transgenerational terror takes root. The trauma is visceral and immediate. For the families of the liquidators, the physical and psychological toll of the cleanup effort is an undeniable reality. So when the children born in the shadow of the sarcophagus inevitably develop standard childhood ailments, autoimmune diseases, or behavioral disorders, the illness is instantly viewed through a dark, terrifying prism. It is not just a fever, it is the radiation. The Chernobyl curse becomes an absolute, undeniable reality for these families. Look at 5-year-old Olesia and her mother, Natalia Witkowska. Olesia suffers from unexplained, stress-induced fainting spells. To a pediatrician in London or New York, this might be a standard pediatric issue. But here, in the long shadow of Reactor Number 4, it is a biological death sentence. Natalia, along with Olesia's grandfather, a former liquidator suffering from radiation-related illness, are absolutely, unshakably convinced that the little girl's condition is the direct genetic legacy of his exposure. Natalia states with tragic, unwavering certainty that her father is infected, she is infected, and now her child is too, calling it a kind of legacy. They operate in direct defiance of their own doctors, who have diagnosed Olesia with a standard form of childhood epilepsy that is entirely unrelated to her grandfather's history in the exclusion zone. For a daughter like Natalia, acknowledging that her child's illness is just a standard biological misfortune might feel like a profound betrayal of her father's martyrdom. Her father sacrificed his health, so the suffering must have a profound meaning. It serves as an organizing principle for their seemingly random suffering. Meanwhile, deep inside the cold, sterile offices of global health authorities, a very different story is unfolding. By 2005 and 2006, global institutional consortiums begin releasing their massive datasets. The Chernobyl Forum, comprising the World Health Organization, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, and other international bodies, looks at the numbers.
They look at the 600,000 military and civilian personnel who were recruited as liquidators. They track the birth records, they count the deformities, and they find nothing. Aside from a significant and undeniable surge in papillary thyroid cancer among individuals who were young children at the time of the accident, caused directly by the uptake of radioactive iodine fallout, there is no evidence of a major public health impact regarding widespread genetic defects, no evidence of decreased fertility, no widespread birth defects. The United Nations determines there is no scientific evidence of increases in overall cancer incidence or non-malignant disorders directly attributable to transgenerational radiation exposure. To the global scientific community, the data is reassuring, definitive, and closed. But this creates a profound hostile cognitive dissonance. You have the world's premier geneticists measuring pristine data in laboratories, declaring the children safe, while the affected families feel the poison deep within their bones.
And the post-Soviet governments only make the terror worse. In a desperate, bureaucratic attempt to provide necessary financial, medical, and educational aid to a devastated population, these governments officially designate liquidators, evacuees, and their children as victims or sufferers. It seems like a benevolent policy. They need help, so the state offers a label to unlock benefits. But this well-intentioned policy inadvertently fosters a pervasive culture of victimhood. It traps the population in a permanent state of psychological victimhood. Children grow up absorbing the relentless societal narrative that they are fundamentally damaged, frail, and doomed to an early death. This deeply internalized fatalism directly leads to massive spikes in clinical depression, severe anxiety, and medically unexplained somatic symptoms. Being officially labeled as a Chernobyl victim functions as a psychological anchor, dragging an entire generation into a self-fulfilling prophecy of ill health and despair. This is the iatrogenic effect of institutional victimhood. The psychological fallout proves vastly more devastating to the broader population than the physical transgenerational genetic effects. The government manufactured a mental health crisis that ultimately outpaced the biological damage of the radioactive fallout.
Meanwhile, the actual men who did the dying are largely discarded and forgotten by the states they protected. Men like Viktor Evkin, a plant worker who was only meters away from the main control room during the explosion. He survived severe radiation burns in those crucial first hours, only to subsequently return to the highly toxic site to work as a liquidator. The bravery is staggering. But decades later, as his health and the health of thousands of others fails, governments and bureaucratic agencies often refuse to legally link their complex illnesses to their radiation exposure. Why? To avoid massive pension payouts. The children of these heroes are forced to watch their fathers waste away in obscurity, while the international scientific community simultaneously tells them that radiation is not to blame for their families' ailments. The families become desperate for validation. Proving genetic damage becomes the only way to validate their historical suffering. And they find champions who validate their deepest fears. Local medical dissidents absolutely refuse to accept the Western consensus. Dr. Irina Helienko, a research director in Ukraine, conducts ongoing, intensive analyses of blood samples from former liquidators and their families. She publicly argues that genetic damage within this population is systematic and that the transmission of a damaged gene pool is highly likely. She directly and controversially contradicts the massive datasets published by the National Cancer Institute and the World Health Organization. To these local voices, the absence of evidence in Western data is not evidence of absence. It is perceived as a failure of methodology or an ongoing minimization of their tragedy. Remember the unnamed son born to the mother who was pressured to abort her abomination? He is born premature and severely underweight. He experiences bizarre developmental anomalies. His teeth fall out and regress multiple times before finally stabilizing. He lives with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. His entire existence is defined by a profound, unanswerable ambiguity.
Are his physical and mental health issues standard variations of human suffering, or are they the direct manifestation of the Chernobyl curse inherited from his father's irradiated blood cells? For 35 years, this mystery paralyzes a generation. The psychological damage is absolute, but the biological truth remains hidden because the technology to actually read the human genetic code at the atomic level does not exist yet.
The global health authorities are relying on broad epidemiological tracking, looking for missing limbs or childhood cancers. They are looking at the macro level. But ionizing radiation does its most terrifying work at the microscopic level. Ionizing radiation causes catastrophic damage to the cellular structure by creating reactive oxygen species. These are rogue molecules that literally break the double strands of DNA. When the human body attempts to repair these severe breaks through a biological process known as non-homologous end joining, or NHEJ, it does something desperate. Specialized cellular proteins frantically grab the severed ends of the DNA and fuse them back together. But here is what the world didn't know for decades. The repair process is imperfect. The cells are surviving, but they are hiding a permanent microscopic memory of the radiation. And in 2021, American scientists are finally going to open the genetic vaults and look directly at the scars. What they find will rewrite the history of human biology.
It is 2021. 35 years have passed since the disaster. You are no longer standing in the radioactive mud of the exclusion zone. You are standing inside the pristine, heavily secured laboratories of the United States National Cancer Institute in Maryland. The chaotic, primitive Soviet cleanup operation has been replaced by the quiet hum of supercomputers and the sterile glow of monitors. The world is finally ready to decrypt the bloodline. For over 3 decades, the truth about the Liquidators' children was trapped in the realm of terrifying anecdotes, localized hysteria, and flawed epidemiological surveys. But science has evolved. The ability to read the human genetic code at the atomic level is now a reality. This is the turning point. The global medical community is about to launch the most exhaustive, technologically advanced investigation into transgenerational radiation exposure in human history. Dr. Stephen Chanick and Dr. Meredith Yeager lead the charge. They are not looking at missing limbs or childhood leukemia rates. They are looking directly at the microscopic blueprints of life. They initiate a massive trio study. This means they are extracting the blood of 105 mother and father pairs from the Chernobyl cleanup. Then they take the blood of their 130 children, all born between 1987 and 2002. They feed this blood into state-of-the-art sequencers to map the entire human genome. It is a monumental undertaking. They rigorously calculate the exact cumulative preconception gonadal radiation exposure each father absorbed while working in the zone, which ranged from 0 to 4,080 milligrays. That is an astonishing, lethal dose for most mammals. The researchers are looking for one specific thing. They are hunting for standard de novo mutations. These are spontaneous genetic alterations that appear in the child's genome but are entirely absent in either parent. These mutations are the biological smoking gun of radiation damage. But here is what the Soviet authorities and the panicked local doctors did not tell those mothers back in 1987. Standard de novo mutations happen naturally. Every single human being on Earth is born with a handful of them. It is simply an error in the biological copying process. The question is not whether the Liquidators' children have mutations. The question is whether they have a statistically higher number of them because of the burning graphite their fathers shoveled off the roof of Reactor 3. The supercomputers grind through the massive datasets for months. The families back in Ukraine and Belarus wait in agonizing suspense. The local medical dissidents who staked their entire careers on the existence of the systematic genetic damage prepare for their ultimate vindication. And then the results are published in the journal Science. The findings send shockwaves through the global scientific community. The rates, the distributions, and the types of standard de novo mutations in the children of the Liquidators are virtually identical to those found in the general unexposed population. There is absolutely no evidence that the intense radiation exposure of the liquidators resulted in standard genetic changes being passed to their offspring. Let that sink in. The men who absorbed lethal doses of invisible fire, who were told by their own government to abstain from having children for 5 years, passed on perfectly normal, healthy genetic code. Dr. Chanik issues a pragmatic statement to the press. He says, if there is a deleterious mutation, it is going to be rare, and they do not see this as a common public health crisis. It is a moment of profound, technologically backed reassurance to the affected families after decades of fear. The ghosts of Chernobyl are finally exorcised. But for the families living in the shadow of the disaster, this clinical calm is jarring. It feels like a violent betrayal of their reality. Remember Natalia and her fainting 5-year-old daughter? Remember the son diagnosed with borderline personality disorder who survived premature birth? For 35 years, they built their entire identity around the sacrifices of their fathers. The radiation was the organizing principle of their seemingly random suffering and functioned as a deeply entrenched way to memorialize the immense, unrewarded sacrifice of their fathers. It gave their pain a historical weight. Now the world's top geneticists are telling them their DNA is perfectly fine. It is a devastating psychological paradox. If the radiation did not cause their illnesses, then what did? The answer is a tragic combination of extreme chronic stress, poverty, institutional mismanagement, and standard human pathology. But telling a traumatized generation that their pain is ordinary is a dangerous game. It strips them of their specialized victimhood status. It forces them to confront the agonizing reality that their government destroyed their mental health far more effectively than the radiation destroyed their biology. And there is another hidden layer to this story, a buried truth that modern science did not anticipate when they decided to crack open the human genome. When you sequence the entire genetic code of a family looking for specific markers of radiation damage, you open Pandora's box. You inevitably uncover a vast array of unrelated, highly sensitive genetic predispositions. The scientists at the National Cancer Institute inevitably find standard inherited BRCA mutations, indicating a high risk of breast cancer, or genetic markers for early onset dementia, which have absolutely nothing to do with Chernobyl. But they present a profound, terrifying ethical nightmare. How does a scientist tell a liquidator's daughter that she is perfectly safe from radiation damage, but she carries a high risk for a completely unrelated genetic disease? Do you disclose these secondary findings to a family that has already endured decades of extreme, radiation-centric health anxiety? They volunteered to find out if Chernobyl poisoned them, not if they are genetically predetermined to develop Alzheimer's in 20 years. The intense ethical debate surrounding whether, how, and when researchers should disclose these findings adds a profound moral dimension to the scientific inquiry. It shows how the pursuit of one scientific truth can accidentally detonate psychological landmines in an already fragile population. The scientists are forced into the uncomfortable role of genetic fortune tellers. By late 2021, the massive TRIO study is celebrated globally as the definitive final word on the matter. The book on the Chernobyl mutant is officially closed. The World Health Organization is satisfied. The United Nations moves on to other crises. The global media completely drops the story. The liquidators are told they did not poison their children, and the world believes the science is settled. But science is never truly settled. Beneath the surface of the published data, a microscopic mystery remains entirely undetected by the standard algorithms. Remember the human body's cellular repair mechanism? That frantic fusing of severed DNA strands called non-homologous end joining? It leaves a trace. It is incredibly subtle. It requires a completely different analytical focus to detect. A focus that looks not at the genes that build proteins, but at the dark matter of the genome. 4 years pass. The narrative is widely accepted. But in 2025, a new group of researchers decides to look at that exact same genomic data again. They're not looking for standard mutations anymore. They narrow their analytical focus to a highly specific, esoteric genomic footprint.
They know that ionizing radiation does not just break DNA, it shatters it in localized bursts. They are looking for something strictly defined as clustered de novo mutations. These are 2 or more mutations occurring in extremely close proximity, within 20 base pairs of each other, resulting specifically from the imperfect repair of DNA breaks caused by radiation. And what they find, hiding in the bloodlines of the liquidators, is about to shatter the 2021 consensus entirely. The radiation did not just vanish, it established the very first clear transgenerational biomarker of prolonged paternal exposure to low-dose ionizing radiation on the human genome. The story's not over. It is about to get much more complicated.
Go back to the hook. 17%. That is the rate of serious congenital disorders found in children born to male liquidators between 1987 and 1992. The expected rate in the general population is approximately 3%. The findings were consistent: elevated thyroid disease, immune system disorders, chromosomal abnormalities, cancers appearing in adolescents at rates 5 times higher than baseline. How is this possible? If the 2021 American study proved there were no standard transgenerational mutations passed down, how did the Ukrainian Health Ministry track 14,000 children and find a biological disaster? Here is what they did not tell you. You have to look at how ordinary people survived the collapse of an empire to understand the data. It is 1995. The Soviet Union is dead. You are living in a newly independent Ukraine. Hyperinflation is ravaging the country. Your savings are worthless. There is no food on the shelves. But the government has one steady source of income available: the Chernobyl pension. Post-Soviet governments officially designate liquidators, evacuees, and their children as victims or sufferers, entitling them to necessary financial, medical, and educational compensation. This creates a dark, absurd paradox. Being sick pays. It is your only lifeline. So you take your child to the local clinic. The clinic is underfunded, freezing, and desperate. The doctor knows your husband shoveled radioactive graphite off the roof of Reactor 3. The doctor also knows you cannot afford bread. So the doctor writes down a diagnosis: immune system disorder, unexplained somatic symptoms. It gets you the pension.
Think about the reservist soldiers clad in rudimentary, self-made lead aprons charging onto the highly radioactive roof of Reactor 3 to physically shovel burning graphite over the edge. They were known as the roof cats. They gave their bodies to stop a continental apocalypse, and a decade later, their sacrifice is reduced to a bargaining chip for basic survival. It is a grim, distinctly post-Soviet absurdity. You trade your irradiated lungs for a loaf of bread. You trade your child's medical record for heating oil. The state poisoned you, then the state collapsed, and the only way to get the new state to acknowledge you is to prove that the poison ruined your offspring. The system literally demanded sick children. This well-intentioned policy inadvertently fosters a pervasive culture of victimhood, but it also skews the data completely. The Ukrainian Health Ministry is tracking these 14,000 children intensely. Every cough, every rash, every minor anomaly is recorded, magnified, and blamed on radiation. The children of liquidators inevitably develop standard childhood ailments, autoimmune diseases, or behavioral disorders, and the illness is instantly viewed through the dark prism of radiation. The Chernobyl curse becomes an absolute, undeniable reality for these families. Meanwhile, the control group, the children of unexposed parents, are living in the same impoverished, collapsed society, but they are not being constantly screened. They are getting sick from malnutrition, from pollution, from the sheer stress of the 1990s, but nobody is writing it down. The 17% statistic is real on paper, but it is a ghost. It is the manifestation of a broken healthcare system trying to keep its citizens alive through a bureaucratic loophole. But the psychological damage of this label is entirely real. Being officially labeled as a Chernobyl victim by the state functions as a psychological anchor, dragging an entire generation into a self-fulfilling prophecy of ill health and despair.
decades post-disaster, epidemiological reviews reveal that liquidators exhibit significantly increased clinical rates of major depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and stress-related medically unexplained physical symptoms. Exhaustive registry studies conducted in Estonia identify a stark increase in clinical diagnoses of nervous system disorders and intentional self-harm among liquidators compared to non-exposed control groups. The psychological impact on the in utero cohort, children whose mothers were pregnant during the chaotic evacuation and immediate aftermath of the disaster, was driven not by biological radiation damage, but by the extreme stress, anxiety, and social stigmatization experienced by their mothers and the pervasive fatalism projected by their physicians. But just as you think the entire legacy is a psychological illusion, the science evolves one more time. It is 2025. A study by Brand and colleagues, published in Scientific Reports, reevaluates the same genomic data from the liquidators and their children. They are not looking for standard mutations. They are looking for a highly specific microscopic footprint called clustered de novo mutations. These are strictly defined as 2 or more mutations occurring in extremely close proximity, within 20 base pairs of each other, resulting specifically from the imperfect repair of DNA breaks caused by radiation.
You have to visualize what happens inside the body when a man walks into a radioactive fire. Ionizing radiation causes catastrophic damage to the cellular structure by creating reactive oxygen species. These are rogue molecules that literally break the double strands of DNA. When the human body attempts to repair these severe breaks through a biological process known as non-homologous end joining, microscopic errors can occur, permanently altering the genetic code. The cellular proteins frantically grab the severed ends of the DNA and fuse them back together, but the repair is imperfect. It leaves a microscopic scar. The 2025 research discovers a statistically significant increase in these rare mutational clusters in the offspring of irradiated parents. The control group of unexposed individuals has an average of 0.88 clustered mutations, establishing the standard baseline rate of natural mutational clustering in the human genome. But the Chernobyl liquidators' offspring show an average of 2.65 clustered mutations. This demonstrates a statistically significant increase that scales with the degree of paternal ionizing radiation exposure. It establishes the very first clear transgenerational biomarker of prolonged paternal exposure to low-dose ionizing radiation on the human genome. The Soviet government lied. The radiation did cross the generational bloodline. The fathers did pass the invisible fire to their children.
This 2025 discovery represents a profound turning point in the story. The families who suffered for 4 decades, who were told by American scientists in 2021 that their DNA was perfectly normal, suddenly have biological proof. The biomarker exists. The DNA is scarred. The liquidators who stripped thousands of kilometers of earth, rolling up the contaminated topsoil like a carpet and dumping it into unlined open pits, did carry the consequences in their cells. The men were right to be terrified when they were officially instructed by authorities not to have children for 5 years following their service. But this revelation brings you back to the terrifying reality of the 17%. If the 2025 scientists found the absolute, undeniable genetic scars of Chernobyl in the children's DNA, does that mean the congenital disorders, the missing teeth, the failing immune systems, and the fainting spells are all directly caused by the radiation? Does the discovery of this biomarker finally prove that the Chernobyl mutant is real? You are staring at the intersection of microscopic biology and massive human trauma. The answer is the final, most devastating paradox of the entire disaster. You are staring at the intersection of microscopic biology and massive human trauma. Here is the final piece of the puzzle. The 2025 study found the mutational clusters. The offspring of the irradiated men carry an average of 2.65 clustered mutations, while the unexposed carry only 0.88. The proof is right there on the sequencer screen.
The men who operated in highly contaminated environments to prevent secondary explosions permanently altered their genetic legacy. But the researchers who discover this footprint immediately issue a crucial, complex warning. The footprint is there, but it is not what you think it is. You have to look at where the radiation actually scarred the genome. Human DNA is vast, but only a tiny fraction of it actually builds the human body. The rest is often referred to as non-coding DNA. This is the dark matter of your genetic code. It does not encode proteins. It does not dictate the shape of your spine, the function of your thyroid, or the strength of your immune system. The 2025 researchers explicitly note that these specific mutations overwhelmingly occur in these non-coding regions. Therefore, they do not manifest as physical traits or illnesses. The radiation left a microscopic, inheritable footprint, but it did not leave a curse. The biological marker exists, but it does not cause the severe diseases the families fear. To fully grasp how negligible this biological risk is, you have to look at normal human reproduction. The scientific consensus highlights that advanced paternal age at the time of conception carries a statistically higher risk of passing on detrimental DNA mutations and associated diseases than the extreme radiation exposure experienced by the Chernobyl cleanup workers. A healthy 45-year-old man in London passes on more dangerous genetic mutations to his child than a 25-year-old liquidator who spent months shoveling radioactive debris off the roof of Reactor 3. But what about the hook? What about the 17%? The expected rate of serious congenital disorders in the general population is approximately 3%. The Ukrainian Health Ministry tracked 14,000 children and found a rate of 17%. Elevated thyroid disease, immune system disorders, chromosomal abnormalities. If the radiation in the non-coding DNA did not cause this, what did? What destroyed the health of these children? The answer is more terrifying than an invisible radioactive isotope. The data firmly establishes that the true, devastating transgenerational legacy of Chernobyl is entirely psychological and sociological. The 17% is real. The children really are sick, but their biology was not broken by a damaged gene pool. Their biology was broken by fear, poverty, and a manufactured societal trauma. Go back to 1986. Think about the in utero cohort. These are the children whose mothers were pregnant during the chaotic evacuation and immediate aftermath of the disaster. These women are dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. They watch the horizon glow with an unnatural fire. Then they are forced to sit in sterile clinics while doctors persistently and aggressively pressure them to abort their pregnancies. The medical establishment warns them that their child might be an abomination or a deformed mutant. The psychological violence inflicted on these mothers is absolute. They endure 9 months of pregnancy utterly convinced by their own doctors that they are carrying radiation-poisoned anomalies. This extreme, unrelenting maternal stress alters fetal development. It floods the womb with cortisol. It changes how the child's nervous system forms. The psychological impact on this cohort was driven not by biological radiation damage, but by the extreme stress, anxiety, and social stigmatization experienced by their mothers, and the pervasive fatalism projected by their physicians. The mother's terror becomes the child's biology. Then, the child is born. You grow up in a collapsing empire. The state officially labels you as a Chernobyl victim or a sufferer. This bureaucratic designation unlocks essential state benefits, but it effectively traps the population in a permanent state of psychological victimhood. You grow up absorbing the societal narrative that you are fundamentally damaged, frail, and doomed to an early death. You watch your father, a former liquidator, deteriorate from clinical diagnoses of nervous system disorders and intentional self-harm. You watch him consumed by major depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and stress-related medically unexplained physical symptoms.
This deeply internalized fatalism directly leads to massive spikes in clinical depression, severe anxiety, and medically unexplained somatic symptoms within the children themselves. The immune system responds to chronic, lifelong psychological trauma by attacking itself. The 17% defect rate is the biological measurement of a broken society. It is the iatrogenic effect of institutional victimhood. A well-intentioned governmental policy manufactured a mental health crisis that ultimately outpaced the biological damage of the radioactive fallout. The label became a self-fulfilling prophecy, destroying a generation's socioeconomic well-being and life satisfaction. This is why the modern genomic data is so hard for the families to accept. Bringing the 2021 and 2025 scientific findings back to the affected families in Ukraine and Belarus creates profound emotional conflict. The families are desperate for the world to acknowledge the true, devastating cost of their father's sacrifice, creating a heartbreaking dynamic where proving genetic damage is somehow seen as the only way to validate their historical suffering. To accept that the 17% is driven by stress and trauma rather than a radioactive curse feels like diminishing the bravery of the men who marched into the fire. But the objective truth of the genomic data offers a different kind of redemption. The data, meticulously gathered from Chernobyl's descendants, acts as the ultimate scientific crucible for understanding the absolute limits of human biology and genetic resilience against ionizing radiation. The human genome is incredibly, unimaginably tough. 600,000 men walked into the most toxic environment on the planet. They absorbed doses of radiation that should have unraveled their bloodlines forever, but their DNA held together. The human genetic code repaired itself well enough to protect the next generation. Today, the physical exclusion zone remains a toxic monument to Soviet failure. The rusted Ferris wheel of Pripyat still stands. The decaying architecture of the Chernobyl exclusion zone is quietly swallowed by the surrounding forest. But outside that zone, the Liquidators' adult children are living today. They carry a microscopic, silent scar in the non-coding dark matter of their cells. It is a permanent monument to their father's sacrifice, inscribed in the very fabric of their existence. But it is just a memory. It is not a weapon. The narrative of the Liquidators' children highlights a crucial, often overlooked psychological phenomenon: the profound, generational damage inflicted by the sheer fear of radiation. We spent decades looking at the physical legacy of the disaster. We tracked the radioactive isotopes, we measured the soil, we sequenced the DNA, but we ignored the shadow. The greatest threat was never lurking in the twisting ladders of their DNA. It was in the suffocating shadow cast over their minds by a frightened society. The real Chernobyl mutant was not created by ionizing radiation. It was created by a terrified medical establishment, a collapsing government, and a desperate population looking for a way to survive the fallout. The children of Chernobyl's liquidators survived the radiation. It was the fear that almost destroyed them.